Thank you all for coming. As Daryl mentioned, I worked with Dr. Denise Herzing in Florida with the Wild Dolphin Project on the Atlantic spotted dolphins and bottlenose dolphins that live over in the Bahamas, and that's where where this work is. I'm now in the Pacific Northwest, but I like to keep my connections with the dolphins out there and my wonderful colleagues. So I'm lucky enough to get to work on some of the data that they've still collected since I've left, and learn more about what's going on. So this, I'm going to give you kind of a background actually of the last few years before this event occurred, because you have to have the context in order to really understand why this is so weird and important. So a lot of this will actually, the first part will cover kind of history, and some of that comes from my dissertation. Actually, a lot of it comes from that. And so we're going to go a little bit through that and then dive into the most recent paper, which is talking about how these two dolphin societies came together. But first, I need to tell you why they were separate in the first place. So just a little bit about spotted dolphins, Atlantic spotted dolphins, Stenella frontalis. They are really cool guys. They gain spots as they get older. So even if we don't know the individual, we can know roundabout what age they are. So two-tones with no spots when they're young. Then speckled as they gain black spots on the belly, then mottled as they gain white spots on the darker top, and then fused where the spots kind of fuse together and look more like a coloration rather than individual spots, depending on the animal. But they're around 6 feet and 200 pounds, very social animals, and very beautiful. So the Wild Dolphin Project has been going out since 1985. So next year is their 40th anniversary, which is super amazing. And then we go out on the research vessel Stenella, which is a 62-foot power catamaran and a very comfortable ocean-going vessel to hang out. Go out for about 10 days at a time, back for 4, out for 10, back for 4 for most of the summer and some of early fall. So they've been going out for a long time. So the main study site is off of Grand Bahama Island called Little Bahama Bank. It is mostly sandy, between 6 to 16 meters, with a stark deep water drop-off edge, which I'll talk a little bit about a little later. But this is, you can see that in the picture there. You can see here the sandbank where the boat is, and then the deep water edge that quickly drops off to hundreds of meters very quickly. So it's a beautiful place to do work, far from most land. And then I always have to do this. Get it back there. No, not there. Okay. So the part of my work previous to what we're going to be talking about today is looking at the social structure of these dolphins. So there's about 100 individuals at any given time before like 2005, which you'll understand in a minute. But what the idea is, there's a lot of differences in how you say what this is. It a community, or is it a cluster, or is it a population? Right, that terminology can be confusing. So one of the first things that we were looking at was, well, is this the animals that live here, those 100 individuals? Is it a community, which is behaviorally self-contained with long-term associations and little interaction outside of it? Or were there social clusters, right? Sets of individuals in nearly permanent mutual association that could then interact with other clusters within a community. So what I did was look at these associations, their social structure, and we found out from my work, along with genetic work and the work of Dr. Herzing, with just where these animals are seen, so geographically. So they are found in 3 socially, genetically, and geographically distinct clusters. So the 100 individuals is one community, with these clusters that they kind of have their own little associations they hang out in, but still interact with one another. So there's the northern, the central, and the southern based on the geography. So the work that I did looked at found that they were non-random associations, right? There were preferred and avoided companions. There was low immigration. It's basically who's born into this population of occasional immigrant that comes in, but not very many. And this kind of social structure was stable from 1985 through 2012. So this is kind of how they did things for a long time. And within that, the associations, like many other dolphin societies, are correlated with age, sex, and reproductive status. So I always like to say that females, it takes a village to raise kids, if anybody who has kids knows. And so they are, if the mothers, this is little gash on the bottom, And so she's hanging out with this other female that also has a kid around the same age. And so if for some reason that calf was lost, then their associations may go down because the other female is now not in the same stage of life, right? Very similar to people where you have kids, you're going to be hanging out with other people who have kids because they understand, right? They have the same needs and requirements. And also their associations are around social familiarity. So those that have grown up together are likely to associate more when they're in adults as well within that reproductive timing. Males is all about the alliances, and I think alliances were made most famous, at least in the cetacean world, with the Shark Bay alliances and bottlenose dolphins, and also in Sarasota. But these guys do have alliances. They are what makes the main reason for them is access to females, right? You have to have your wingman to help get a female. It seems to be helpful for these guys. Generally within the same age class, so mottled with mottled or mottled and fused as they get older. They do have two levels of alliances. So the first order is basically a pair or a trio that pretty much are there together all the time. These are like best friends for life, basically, or at least a long time. And then the second order alliances are when two alliances get together to fight a common foe. So that could be, a shark or another spotted dolphin group, or say the bottlenose dolphins that tend to pick on the spotted dolphins there. So that's the kind of the male and female version of associations, which are important to understand as we move into what has changed. So another thing that they have going on on Little Bahama Bank is that these spotted dolphins feed on the deep water edge at night, whereas the bottlenose dolphins that are sympatric, that live in the same area, do not. So they use that deep water edge a fair amount. And then these bottlenose dolphins that they live with sympatrically, there is a complex society, and that's a whole nother talk we can discuss. I did do their interspecies associations and looked at what that looked like and how they interact. So it's very complex, but so they've got a lot going on in those 100 individuals that live on Little Bahama Bank. So what the big thing that happened in 2004 was two major hurricanes came through. These were within 2 or 3 weeks of each other, and they were strong Category 3 and Category 4 hurricanes. And we looked in the past, the historical data, and it does not look like any hurricane of that magnitude had gone through that area before in the lifetime of the dolphins that are living there now. And what happened is after that, we lost 36% of the population. So it went from 100 to down to 67. And so this caused a huge amount of demographic loss. Whether they left or they died, we can never be sure, but they never returned, and this was their home. So it's, to me, unlikely that they just left and didn't come back. It's likely that they passed away. There were similar losses in all age classes, but the proportion decreased with increasing age. So the older individuals were more likely to survive to some degree. And after that time, immigration was still low. So basically they just lost 36% of the population, and that was it. And so my dissertation was like, well, what happens? What happens when you lose 30% of your population, and what happens to your social structure? So what happened, it was a very interesting natural experiment that I got to do, is that I looked at their social structure again after all these changes had occurred. And there was little change to the overall association patterns, which was interesting, right? Something so large doesn't really strongly affect the overall way that these animals associate. They still have the social clusters. And a lot of times you see with loss that the remaining groups will come together because you need to have more animals to do the behaviors and whatnot that you need. So it wouldn't be surprising to see that the North, Central, and Southern animals grouped up together in solidarity, right, to do what they need to do. But they didn't. They still kept those. Those are deeply embedded in their kind of culture, their associations. So they were still in the North, Central, and Southern, and then the sex preferences were still present. So females associating with females, males in their male alliances, stronger within sex than between sex. Right? So females with females, males with males. So those overall things were still the same, but there were changes. Interestingly, the clusters themselves were more cohesive. So instead of the three clusters coming together, it's just the cluster, each individual cluster became more cohesive, which makes sense if that is a strong part of your identity, is being in those different clusters. And there was less age stratification. So age was also, usually you hung out with others of your same age, again, very kind of similar to humans, but there seemed to be less of that. So overall, more cohesion within each cluster, but not across all the clusters. And then we also saw that there were simplified male alliances. So we basically didn't really see many, if at all, any of the second order alliances. And maybe that's a factor of they just didn't need to have them in this time of restructuring, but mainly those just pairs and trios that were male alliances. And interestingly, they started as speckled juveniles. So most of the time, the alliances start, at least you see that the association level that strongly in the mottled or fused age class, so the young adults and adults. So it was interesting to see that they were starting that process seemingly a bit earlier in their growing up. So overall, the big picture kind of stayed the same, but we have these tiny, smaller differences that did occur after this loss of individuals. So this integration of two dolphin societies happened because of this other rare event that occurred. After the hurricanes, they stayed where they were. Everything was fine, or seemingly. They didn't, seemingly go anywhere, do anything. And so this is now from 2004 to, so 8 or 9 years later, all of a sudden, there was a huge exodus. And 52 of the dolphins from Little Bahama Bank moved over 50 kilometers over deep water to Great Bahama Bank in 2012 or 2013. We don't know exactly when they left, but sometime between field seasons. So the Great Bahama Bank off of Grand Bahama Island, or Bimini, good Lord. I keep mixing those up. So Great Bahama Bank is off of Bimini. Has a similar ecology, but it's about twice the size as Little Bahama Bank. And it already has a resident spotted and bottlenose dolphin community. So they mirrored each other, of the two dolphin species that were there on Little Bahama Bank and Great Bahama Bank. And so, but these, almost more than half really of the animals from Little Bahama Bank just up and moved. And so this is very strange, because you would think that possibly they would do that after the hurricanes, after losing those individuals, but they didn't. So why did this happen? And what's interesting is when this occurred, we also saw these kind of odd social structure changes. So you have this uncharacteristic split in matrilines. So generally the mothers and daughters kind of still hung out together as they got older. We had an adult mom leave their juvenile daughter, so left her on Little Bahama Bank, and a young adult daughter leaves the mom and her siblings. Then the other weird thing is that, so this was mostly central cluster. So all of the central cluster left, but there were a few of the northern and southern guys that came along. And when they moved, they had completely random associations, which is completely different than what they were doing for the last, 40 years. They moved together as just like everybody hung out with everybody. There was no preferred or avoided companions. They were all just one big group. Even though they were across those cluster definitions. So we have these strange things where mothers are leaving daughters, and now all of these guys are coming together and moving as one to a seemingly unknown area. We don't know if they know that was over there, how they knew that it was over there. And also, what happens if you have a huge amount of animals moving into a place that already has a resident, with their own social structure going on, population. So we were looked into why this happened, and we did do a paper on this as well. What happened, right? So we documented the move and then dug into kind of why this occurred. And so there were lower sea surface temperatures and lower chlorophyll A levels, which is a proxy for plankton production, that was on Little Bahama Bank that we did not see at the same time frame off of Great Bahama Bank. And so what we think is there was possibly a tipping point for prey availability. And so this is an indication that the environment caused this demographic change. So, and the environment also caused the demographic change of losing all those individuals after the hurricanes. But so these guys, seemingly, it seems like they're just, the food collapsed on Little Bahama Bank, so they had to go somewhere. So they decided to move to Great Bahama Bank. So this is a busy graph here, but what I want you to take away is that the lines are all connected. And so although you see that there are connections, but you see that there are two kind of distinct groups. So there's the grayed out names and then the light names. So the ones on the left-hand side moved to Grand Bahama Bank. That's why they're called MGBBs. These are our Little Bahama Bank immigrants. And then the ones on the right are the Great Bahama Bank individuals that are resident to the area that they just moved to. And so even though there are some connections, right, you are going to, with anybody that's coming into your society, you're going to have some interaction with them, but how much is the question. And what we saw was basically they didn't really interact very much. It was the Little Bahama Bank guys and there was the Great Bahama Bank guys, and they were like, we're not really going to talk. We're going to talk if we have to, but we're not going to talk too much, except for a couple, this Duke and Lord in the middle, that those two are, those two animals seem to be a connection, right? They had more connections than anybody else. So they were maybe the greeters, I guess, or were more interested in striking up relations with these new animals that moved in. So what this has led to is that this disruption is another natural experiment that we could look at. It's a very unique opportunity to observe how two very distinct dolphin communities do or do not integrate over time, right? So it's not just, usually immigration happens in dribbles, right? You have a few individuals that move in at any given time, and that's fairly easy, quote unquote, to integrate into an already established society. But if you have 52 animals that are coming in to this resident group that's already here, is there going to be enough food in the first place? Are you going to be able to access the food because the other individuals may be like, this is our food, or this is our house, or this is our habitat? Is there going to be fighting? How does that integration occur if it does? And so that's what we were looking forward to looking at with this unique natural experiment. So the data for collecting data for the Wild Dolphin Project happens between May and September, and this is for the last 40 years. And we identify the individuals by spotting patterns. So you just kind of look at it as a Rorschach test of like, what does that spot pattern look like to you? And then use those to match the individuals. We age them by the birth year and or the color phases. So oftentimes we know for most of the individuals the year that they were born. And then we do determine sex by observation of the genital area. Luckily, they are very friendly and show us their bellies quite often. So most of the individuals that we have in the analysis and in the population are of known age and sex, which is a kind of a unique thing. So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds. I'm not going to get too far into the weeds of methods too much, but just to give you an idea of what we did. The previous work that I had done on their social structure on the animals on Little Bahama Bank was broken up into 3-year periods. It allowed us to have more individuals within the that have enough sightings to be able to be included. For social analysis, you do really want to make sure that you have a certain number of sightings for each animal to really be representative of what that animal is actually doing. So by pooling the summers, we are able to increase that number and have more that have the greater number of sightings that we want. So because of that past data collected that way, we also wanted to do it the same way, so it's an easy comparison. So we pooled the data from, so the exodus occurred around 2013-14. And then, so now we're looking at the 6 years after that. So we documented the initial, this is what happened. They didn't interact. So now what's going to happen? What are they ever going to interact, or are they going to stay like that? That's the question we wanted to answer. So we're looking at the 3 years, the 6 years past. So the first 3 years and the second 3 years as to see kind of what that pattern was. So we defined a group as all dolphins in sight usually involved in the same activity. Non-calf individuals, in association data, you don't count calves because the calves are dependent on their mothers, and so then are their associations. So they're not kind of independent of that. So 4 or more times per pooled period. And the rest of that there is a bit more about the SOCPROG, which is, or SOCPROG, I think is actually what's actually termed. I always like to say social program, but it's a software program by Hal Whitehead, and it's awesome. It allows us to do all this great data collection and analysis on social associations. So we promoted the groups within samples. We did mantle tests and MRQAP tests that look at between classes, so sex and age and residency status. Basically, are they hanging out more within those categories or between them, right? Is it a driver of the associations or not? And then we counted strong associations as 2 or more times the mean COA of the study group or study cluster, depending on how you define things, because the numbers can be different depending on a population. So if you have 0.05 might be really strong in your population, but 0.3 is really strong in somebody else's population, for example. So we use the mean for your population to then say, well, twice that must be important within that population or community. So so the coefficients of association, to do all that, we use the half weight index. There's a couple of choices you can have, but that's a pretty common one. So to look at the community structure, we looked at, we used the modularity tests to differentiate between if there were clusters within that community or it was one community or more. And then we used standardized lagged association rates, which looks at the temporal stability overall. So how long is it likely that an association will last over years or days or months or whatever. And so then we could also look at that between sex, and we can also look at that between residency status. So are animals that are hanging out with other, are Little Bahama Bank animals hanging out with other Little Bahama Bank animals more or less over time compared to with Great Bahama Bank animals. So that was the idea, to try to figure out basically did they integrate or did they not? So these kind of demographic changes that we've talked about, whether it's from a hurricane or moving into a new place, they can often result in altered social behavior and social structure in many social species. So we've seen this in sperm whales and killer whales, in chimpanzees. I forgot what the species of that monkey is down there, but it's very cute. They've also seen it there in bottlenose dolphins and spotted dolphins. So the changes in who's in the population will change or community will change what that group looks like, right? Because you are changing the individuals that are driving that. And so a lot of this may come down to the individuals, right? Are they able to work it out or work with the animals that they're moving into? So these immigration events in particular are really important, right? Do you allow immigrants into your population? Do you have the social resources, the habitat, the space? Do you have the food resources to be able to take those animals in, so to speak? And so these immigration events also interact with the demographic processes that are already there, right? So what's happening in that population? Well, you just lost a whole bunch of individuals from a hurricane. Well, maybe immigration would be easier during that time than before, right? So these combination of things can shape the population dynamics and the resulting social structure, which has important impacts on long-term survivability of a population, right? These social structure changes can affect how well they do together, and then ultimately how well they mate and find food and survive. So these immigration events are really important to understand, but they're not well studied. And particular large-scale immigration events aren't well studied because they're rare. Right? You again usually see immigration events happening with just a couple at a time. This huge group moving is a rare event. So we have the Little Bahama Bank immigrants as one cohesive cluster coming into Great Bahama Bank. The Great Bahama Bank residents, based on previous analysis, was one community with no social clusters. So they have a different social structure than those that are coming from Little Bahama Bank. So what's going to happen? That's the question. Dun, dun, dun. So I have the data down there for anybody who's interested in looking at that, but I will tell you, the kind of the gist. So we do look at using SourcePro, we are able to look at stuff and show to understand what the power is of the analysis that we're doing, because you want to make sure that there's enough power to say what you're saying from the data. So the statistical power for both sets of data indicated that it was a good representation of the social system, which allows us to go further and look at more more detailed information. So if this was not the case, then looking at the more detailed associations wouldn't mean too much, because we don't have the power to say that that's really what it was. In particular, the social differentiation, which is the S number down there, was above 0.5, which means a fairly well differentiated society, which basically means that there are preferred and avoided companions, and you can look at those and say those are actually what's happening. So the other thing that showed that we look at is the standard deviation of the real versus the permuted data, and that indicated that they were the associations were non-random. So again, if they were random, you wouldn't do any more analysis because it's just random associations. But because they're non-random means that they are preferred and avoided, and you can then look into those details. So are they friends? Are they foe? Or are they both with these animals coming into this area? So the 6 years after that exodus, in about 2013, 2014, integration begins. They are now, in these 6 years, one community. So when they first moved, it was like, nope, Little Bahama Bank, Great Bahama Bank, that's it. After 6 years, we see they have integrated. There is one community, but there are no strongly defined social clusters. So they've all integrated together to some degree, but there's still more to the story. So the groupings that are within the community, if we look at them in more detail, which we're allowed to do because of the power we had for the analysis, we sheds light on the associations that may be important to the dolphins, even though they're not distinct clusters, right? Social clusters. So it did show that there was an increase in associations between the Little Bahama Bank and Great Bahama Bank individuals, which makes sense because the analysis showed they are living in one community with no distinct clusters or groupings. But what was interesting is that when you looked at the clusters that were there, but we couldn't say that they were definitely because we don't have the power to say it for that particular analysis. If we look at those, though, it's interesting because the clusters one of them was only Great Bahama Bank animals. And then there were 2 clusters with Little Bahama Bank and Great Bahama Bank individuals. But the cluster membership varied across years. So we had some that were in the group 1 with a mixed residency status, and then maybe that animal moved over to group 2, or there was a Great Bahama Bank individual that was in that mixed cluster, but then went back to the only Great Bahama Bank cluster. So there was some movement, and then some of that is because not every individual was included in each data set because they didn't meet the sightings criteria. But it's just interesting to look at because you do still have, I think the main thing to come away from this is that they still had the residency status preferences. So even though they were mixed and they were integrating, they still were like, but I really like hanging with my Great Bahama Bank individuals, or I really like hanging with my Little Bahama Bank individuals. So if we look again into the age and sex and then the residency status, right? So these main players as to what shapes social structure in a lot of populations. You have age and sex was a driver of the associations similar to their communities prior to the exodus. So hanging out with others of the same sex more often than between, hanging out with those of the same age more than between, right? So for both the Great Bahama Bank and Little Bahama Bank guys, they both still had those age and sex kind of restrictions in how they associate. But the biggest thing was that the residency status, they still have strong associations within that original community, even though they're interacting and living in one community. But it's hard to let go of your friends, I guess we could say. So this is, again, just the data that shows that. So these are the coefficients of association. And we can see that the within age versus the between age, it was much higher. Again, within sex and then between sex was higher. And within residency status and between residency status, this one was almost double or more than double for each of those. And they were statistically significant. And then what's really interesting is that this bottom graph is the MRQAP. And basically what this does is like, okay, those are important, but it kind of ranks them as to which one is the most important that determines that they were the variables that were helping to shape the observed associations. And so what that came back with is that by far the residency status was the strongest indicator of the partial coefficients, correlation coefficients, that they were the best predictor variable for the patterns that were observed. So the age and sex was important, but the residency status was the most. So they still have those strong associations within their communities, their original communities. And then how they associate with one another between the Great Bahama Bank animals and the Little Bahama Bank animals was interesting because it varied a little bit. So these bottom two, this is the standard lagged association rate. So looking at it over time, the data is on the bottom and the standardized association rate is on the left. And basically this is saying like how basically when are they going to drop below the null association rate, which means there's no association. They all stayed above the null association rate. So they're all interacting with each other without, stopping basically. They're all interacting with each other. But if you look at the individuals, when we're looking at it between residency status, we have these ones here. So this is the Little Bahama Bank to Little Bahama Bank guys. So within their own residency. And then the starred one here is the Great Bahama Bank to Great Bahama Bank. So they're pretty consistent. They're hanging out together all the time. Then you look at this top one, that is the Great Bahama Bank to Little Bahama Bank. So it seems that the Great Bahama Bank, it's more likely that the Great Bahama Bank individuals will reassociate with an immigrant, the Little Bahama Bank. More so than if we look down here, the bottom, the one that goes below that line, that one is the Little Bahama Bank to Great Bahama Bank individuals. So more likely that the Great Bahama Bank individuals will associate with the Little Bahama Bank individual, and opposite for the vice versa, right? So the Little Bahama Bank guys are more likely to not reassociate with a Great Bahama Bank individual, which is interesting. Like, so maybe the Great Bahama Bank ones are the ones that are trying to make friends. So we're seeing these kind of interesting, it's one community that come together, but there's still these nuances that are occurring and probably shifting what's happening in the overall social structure that's going to come out of this new group. So what's interesting to look at is, what are the costs for grouping together, having a Little Bahama Bank individuals and Great Bahama Bank individuals together? There are costs, right? So in a mixed group, other researcher from Dr. Herzing's lab looked at the behavior dynamics within those groupings and found that there was increased aggression and decreased foraging. So, if you're spending time in those groups, it might be not good for you, or at least over the long term, of how often you can do that. The Little Bahama Bank dolphins had larger home ranges. They were found farther north. And I'm going to link back to that deep water edge. Similar in Great Bahama Bank, but that farther north area is an area where they can get to that deep water a bit easier or have more access to it. So it's possible that that's a reason why they're up there using that deep water edge. So perhaps they're using that more. So that also may be a reason why we saw the associations that we did. The Little Bahama Bank guys are having to stay farther north. They have less time to interact with those individuals because they have to go forage in other places to be able to get their food, and also seeing that increased aggression when they are in those groups, they might want to avoid it. But also the mixed group, there are benefits. So you can increase your mating opportunities. So now you're mixing between two previously genetically separate populations or communities. So this can increase the gene flow between these two previously separate ones. So that would be a benefit genetically long term. So there we found in other work I've done with the bottlenose dolphins there, and work in many other species show that there is a difference in acceptance of male versus female immigrants. Sometimes females are more accepted, some are males, sometimes neither. But in this case, it indicated that there could be that the males are more easily accepted. We did see a mixed residency alliance between Little Bahama Bank and the Great Bahama Bank animals, and the mixed clusters that had both individuals from each population, or each community, sorry, were basically a mixed group that had mainly Great Bahama Bank individuals. The Little Bahama Bank individuals, most of them were males that were in that group, and vice versa. So it seems like the males had a bit easier time in interacting with the other residency status. So males still had their strong associations. So we have alliances that were identified in that remained over both periods, and then some that changed between. So here's our inter-residency status with Lhasa from Little Bahama Bank and Lord and Drogo from Great Bahama Bank, but we did not see that in the following data set. And then you can see the other ones where some have been added or removed, and some stayed the same. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button in that. So basically that what to take away from here is that there are male alliances still present in both communities, and that may be important in how these two communities are integrating. So the male alliances are important on Little Bahama Bank. They were possibly not evident on Great Bahama Bank previously. We don't have as much data on that on what those animals were doing beforehand, before the move in 2013, 2014. But we do know that they were present for both communities after the Exodus. So when those animals came in, there were alliances in Great Bahama Bank and Little Bahama Bank individuals. And they have continued. So what we found out is that the social structure of each community has changed. And what's really interesting, I think, is that the past relationships are continuing to influence this new social structure that's happening. And so, you had two very different groups coming together in terms of social structure. The Little Bahama Bank guys even changed their social structure as they were moving, and now they're coming together, and these interactions and these associations and the behaviors that they're doing together are shaping what this community is going to look like in the future. And this is really important, right? So social plasticity is really important, so to be able to exploit different habitats and survive these crazy changes that occur, which are probably going to happen more often with climate change and increased human disturbances. And so to be able to be flexible, that's what social plasticity means, right? To be able to be flexible is really important to be able to continue past these changes, right? We have to work with what we got, right? So we see that some aspects of social structure remain. So those seem to be kind of more deeply embedded in how these animals relate to one another, but some things can change, and that's where that plasticity comes into account. And so the social structure of each community that we have anywhere may play a role in the ability to integrate and ultimately survive. So if one's really rigid and doesn't have much that they can change, they may not be able to move into another area and interact and survive with another group like these guys have. So it's really important that we understand what these social structures look like, so that when these changes that occur and may occur more often, we know what, or at least we don't know what's going to happen, but we have a better idea of how well they're going to be able to survive. So in conclusion, merging of two different stable communities is complicated and it takes time, right? They moved in and everybody's like, whoa, what's happening here? And then after 6 years, like, okay, we see that integration occurring, but it doesn't happen overnight. You have the loss and gain of these new social connections and the maintenance of the old social connections. This creates this very dynamic process that is molding the social structure of the community or population, whichever terminology you're using for what you're looking at. So demographic changes can alter social interactions that affect survival, reproduction, and movement, right? If they can't reproduce together, they're not going to survive. So you got to be able to communicate with each other and live together in the same place. And so I think one of the biggest things that's come from this, at least for me, is showing how much, especially in social animals, that demography is important, right? The individuals are important, because there could be one dolphin that's like the linchpin for everybody, and when that animal's gone, like the band disbands, right? And all sorts of variations of that theme of just important individuals in certain places. And so understanding that is really important to understand how these are going to be able to survive, and what we need to do in conservation efforts in order to help protect them. So I think I'm only a few minutes over. So I'd like to thank the Wild Dolphin Project, and of course my co-authors, Cassandra Volker and Dr. Denise Herzing. Always love working with the Wild Dolphin Project and the dolphins I love so much from way back then. But we like to thank all the Wild Dolphin Project crew and volunteers that were involved in the, like I said, 40 years of data that's been used in many of the studies that we've done. And everything was done under a research permit from the Department of the Bahamas. So with that, I will be done. And thank you all for listening. And I will happy to take any questions.
Okay, well, can everybody hear me? I understand there were some problems up front. Do you hear me, Cindy? Yeah, yes. Okay, great. Sorry about that. I don't see any questions lined up yet, but I found it a very interesting talk, and I can't help but want to anthropomorphize with so much of what you said, but I find it interesting that it's the Great Bahama dolphins that are essentially more likely to form new associations. It seems to me there must be something about familiarity of where you are that influences in a sense, your ability to take some risk of developing new relationships. Does that sort of make some sense to you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I agree with you. It's hard. It's easy to kind of anthropomorphize. And I think some of that is valid too, honestly. Like they have very similar societies to we do, and they are individuals and social. And so I think that could be, it a lot of times, in human societies, when people are coming in, the immigrants are, they're scared. They don't know what's going on. It's a new place and everything. So that helping hand that comes out is easier to do for the people that are already there and familiar with their surroundings and whatnot. So I think there could be something to that.
Yeah. Another question that crossed my mind is, are you still doing observations at Little Bahama Bank? So do you know to what extent there's movement back and forth? And are the resources better now than they were when this mass immigration occurred?
Yeah, so Dr. Herzing I unfortunately have not been out in the Bahamas in quite a few years now, but Dr. Herzing they're still doing their research out there, and they split their time between Little Bahama Bank and Great Bahama Bank because they still want to know what's happening to the few individuals that stayed there. And up until recently, there wasn't movement back and forth, but I do believe that at least one or two animals went back to Little Bahama Bank. But for the most part, everybody's stayed where they are. And I don't think anybody new has gone to Great Bahama Bank, but don't quote me on that because I'm not sure, but I do know that there was some movement. So it's really interesting too, because they live in that sandbank. Those animals, we see them every year, like some for the whole 30, 40 years, and so like they don't go in deep water except to go feed. So going over deep water to this random new place is really brave. I guess is a good way to put it. So yeah, so there's still the animals up on Little Bahama Bank, just a little bit harder to find in the larger area there.
Now, one last question before, actually, maybe I'll hold off because I see a couple of questions have come up. So we'll let the audience ask questions now.
Go ahead and read one that we have, which is whether there was a kind of smoking gun or final explanation for why there was that food collapse at the Little Bahama Bank.
Then as far as I know, we don't really know. Like we were looking into that data, our colleagues that were helping with that paper, and because we kind of like, what happened? How can we figure out if there was a collapse? And I don't know if we know why. There was no other like smoking gun or telltale sign of like, oh, that connects with that. Like it was just kind of like, boom. And you would have thought, like, I think for me, I was like, this would have made sense right after the hurricane, because maybe some of those, we don't know if the animals, if they did die after the hurricanes, we don't know whether they just all died in the hurricane or they died afterwards because the food collapsed, right? But then everybody stayed and everything was fine for like 9 years. So it seemingly ran like out of nowhere that this collapse happened, but I'm sure it's not out of nowhere. We just don't know why.
Any other? Sorry, I was just going to ask
Go
any
ahead.
other sort of areas that you know of in that part of the world where food collapse occurred at a similar point in time?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
But I don't know if anybody, like, we wouldn't have known had the animals not left, right? There was a reason for us to look. So it's possible it happened elsewhere and just nobody's looking at it because of, whatever.
Go
Yeah, I
ahead,
had sort of a
Teresa.
related question to that one. Sorry, Daryl, the Zoom overlap, which was, and I might have missed this if you said it, because you said there was the bottlenose dolphins in association. Like if you saw any similar food impacts on them or on, I don't know if there's any other marine mammal species in that area that you all look at, or were noticing anything quantitative or kind of qualitative observations about changes.
Yeah, so the bottlenose dolphins, they're near and dear to my heart. That was I did my master's on, so I was like, bottlenose dolphins are cool too, with the spotted dolphins out there. But they, as far as I know, they didn't see any great changes in their. We saw changes after the hurricanes because we lost 30% of those as well. But there was a large immigration in for them, but not the spotted dolphins, which is really interesting. So why they were able to do that and the spotted weren't, I don't know. But they also feed on. I mean, they have overlap in their food, but they kind of separated habitat niches. So the bottlenose dolphins do crater feeding on the big sandbanks, and so the spotted dolphins will also feed in on the seafloor, catching some fish. But the bottlenose dolphins do the special crater feeding, which they dig their heads into the sand and look like ostriches sticking their heads in the sand. And then the spotted dolphins feed on the deep water edge at night. So, but we've never seen the bottlenose dolphins do that. So it seems like there is this prey partitioning to some degree. And so maybe whatever collapse happened, it didn't affect what the bottlenose dolphins were eating, but did what the spotted dolphins were eating. Theory.
Any other questions here? I guess I just a comment maybe is I think this is a great example of the benefits of kind of long-term projects where you just happen to be doing something somewhere when something very unusual occurs, and it just takes you off in a different direction and produces some really neat new information. I remember back in the early 1980s studying California sea lions on the Channel Islands. Just happened to have been there for several years before a really extreme El Nino occurred, back when we knew very little about El Ninos, and just opened up a whole set of new projects to follow on. So
yeah, I agree. It's the same thing happened. I basically was going to do my dissertation on something slightly different, and then this happened, and I was like, whoa, we should do this. And I highlight that as well often, is that we wouldn't know if we went in there after the hurricanes, we would have not known that this was completely different than it was for the last 40 years before that. The only reason we know is because Dr. Herzing's been out there since 1985 documenting. And I do that with it here, like it's long-term monitoring. It's so important, and yet underfunded and under cared for. But you don't know what changes are if you don't know what's normal. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that is very important. And you get to see really cool stuff like this and be able to look at it.
Excellent. Well, I don't see any further questions popping up in Q&A, so I guess maybe we're close to our time. So once again, thank you for a very interesting talk. Thank you for the paper in Marine Mammal Science, and presumably we'll see some of the work from the Salish Sea popping up in Marine Mammal Science as well.
Yep. Plan on it.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So I think at this point we'll sign off and tune into next month for our next seminar. All right. Thank you much.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Cindy. That was wonderful.